Welcome to On the Spectrum. I'm your host, Terri Matthews, and this is the show where we inform you, entertain you, and yes, educate you about all things autism. We like to call it Prescription TV. Joining me on today's episode of Let's Talk is our good friend and in-house expert, NeQuetta Alfred, and we're going to be talking about functional behavioral analysis. That's a big word, FBA, and no, it's just not a bunch of alphabet. It actually does help our children, and NeQuetta's here to give us some guidance and some information on what that actually means.
Absolutely.
Hi, NeQuetta.
Hi, Terri.
Oh my goodness. So in autism, I always say that we need our own dictionary.
Yes.
Because there's all of these acronyms
Yes.
and abbreviations, ABA, FBA, BCS, TSS, PCA.
Yes.
You know, I'm like, what in the world?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit, what actually is FBA and how does it differ from ABA?
Yes, so FBA stands for Functional Behavior Assessment.
Oh, assessment, not
yes.
analysis.
No, it's interchangeable.
Okay, I
and
thought so.
What this assessment does is it helps to identify trigger behaviors as well as behavior interventions, but most importantly, it looks into what behaviors are impeding the student's learning so that we can tackle those behaviors. How it differs from ABA is, ABA, you have to go through typically some type of behavioral health or mental health, not exactly with FBA. FBA can be administered by the school or behavior analysis.
Oh, I love that. So just so that there's clarity out there for our families, with ABA, you actually have to go through some sort of evaluation before
Yes.
it can actually be implemented.
Yes.
Where FBA can be implemented right away.
Yes, even without the evaluation. Typically, someone would look at an FBA or a student and say, can we request an FBA? Because they can't determine what is triggering this student's behavior or what is the function of behavior. Is it attention? Is it to escape the work? Or is it sensory? So they'll order an FBA to determine what's next.
And are FBAs typically what we see in an IEP, or does a kiddo have to actually have an IEP, which is an individualized education plan for those that are out there in our audience who don't know what an IEP is? Do they actually have to have an IEP before an FBA
That's a great question.
can be started?
No,
Okay.
absolutely not. A student can request a parent can request an IEP, a behavioral health agency can request an IEP, and the school district can also request it. FBA. FBA is all requested by some type of person that's advocating, saying, this is not working. The interventions are not working. Whatever we're doing, it's not working. So they need to determine what else can we do.
So just to clarify that, I can walk in as a parent, rip open my Superwoman shirt, and say, I need an FBA.
It is a process. Yes, you can request an FBA, but it is a process. Usually you have to put it in writing just like you have to for an IEP.
Right.
And it's up to the district. Now the district can say, hey, we're not going to put an FBA in place, because they can put a 504 plan in place. And you're right, we do need a dictionary for these words. 504 plan is a substitute for an FBA. It's like a smaller version of an FBA, whereas an FBA is a huge assessment. Typically, they'll get a behavior therapist like myself to go out, observe this kid for 15 hours, 20 hours, up to 20, 25 hours in all different environments, home, school, community. And with that assessment, you're looking for what are the target behaviors. Normally it's out of seat, disrespectful, aggression. What are these target behaviors? Then you're looking for the function. What is the function? Why are these behaviors occurring? Escape. The child probably don't want to do the work. Is it attention? The child probably wants attention. Is it sensory, something that we possibly can't see that's going on up there? But in all, the FBA will determine what's causing the behavior so that a person like you or anybody else can help this child in school, class, or in the environment.
Well, that leads me kind of to my next question. Should all children on the spectrum have an FBA implant?
No. In my experience, what I see happening is parent go in and she go in to see an evaluator, a licensed psychologist. She has no clue what this psychologist is really talking about behavior-wise. She's just telling him the kid is kicking, he's crying, and she's not really using terminology that a therapist would use.
Right.
So when they submit this piece of information to the insurance company, they deny all services for the parent. So what they do is the insurance company will go back and say, let's put a functional behavior assessment so we can put a therapist in place to go and observe this kid for 15, 20, 25 hours to see exactly what's going on. I've conducted over 120 FBAs in the last year and a half, and not one has been denied.
Wow, 120. That's a lot of observing of kids.
Yes.
And just for our parents and people out there, let me let me make sure that this is clear. Who can do an FBA? I mean, is that anybody? School teachers, therapists, psychiatrists, pediatricians? Because in the world of autism, there are so many services and people with different expertise that we're leaning on. And I'm trying my best, especially for our audience out there, to help educate them on who they should be talking to, how they should advocate for themselves, and who's important to tap on for what.
Absolutely. So if a child has an IEP and the parent feels like the needs are not being met in the IEP, there are several behavioral issues. They don't see no conducive changes, nothing positive. The parent should be requesting an FBA. She has that right. The SEL, Special Ed Liaison, here we go with these acronyms again.
SEL,
The
ABA.
Special Ed Liaison can also request an FBA based off the special ed teacher not identifying the kid's behaviors or target behaviors or interventions appropriately. Lastly, who can request it and who typically requests it is an agency, a behavioral health agency, because remember, an insurance company is not going to pay for a kid to receive services based off a parent going in there using very little terminology. So by the time we go in and use ABA, behavior therapy, we're making sure those kids are getting services.
And the person who's actually implementing these services or evaluating this child is a behavioral therapist.
So who does the interview and the observation? Because that's a behavior therapist, but a psychologist does the evaluation. Behavior therapists cannot evaluate. We just go in, observe, interview. We're typically talking to everybody that's dealing with this kid. When I go in, I want to speak to the counselor, the special ed liaison. If he has a 504 plan, if he has an IEP, I want to speak to every teacher, and I want to have a meeting to determine who else is involved on the case. That's how you get a kid approved for services versus inviting very little people and getting denied because the insurance company know that all these people are involved, but you never reached out to them.
So I want to make sure our parents aren't discouraged out there, because this is a lot of language, and when you have a newly diagnosed kid that's on the spectrum and you have all of these people with all this level of expertise and you're just trying to navigate, through this process. For our parents, if they needed an FBA and they saw behaviors, like for me, I saw behaviors in Jaden and I wouldn't know why. One, he hated coming home to do his homework. He just absolutely hated it.
So that's an escape.
When we transitioned schools, when we moved, it took a lot of adjusting in the school. And in his case, the team had to come together because there were a lot of behaviors that we were not used to. And so just like you, a behavioral therapist sat down, decided that an FBA was needed, and they observed Jaden in the school as well as interviewed him at home. So just for parents and for clarity and simplicity's sake, because again, we need our own dictionary in the world of autism, I want parents to really understand they can raise their hand and they can say, I'm having behaviors at home. And I also want parents to feel comfortable because, when you think you got it together and the world makes you feel like, or you feel like I'm not a good parent if I'm dealing with behaviors, because let's face it, in a neurotypical child, if you have some behaviors, you're taught just to discipline the child. Discipline doesn't work the same way with our kids on the spectrum. So what has to happen is that if we feel like we don't know how to parent, we're embarrassed. We don't want to ask these questions. We just keep dealing with behaviors, and that child is frustrated, we're frustrated, the house is frustrated, and nothing gets accomplished. So I want parents out there to really understand that if you have a child that has some behaviors, if you can't control those behaviors, it's okay. This is part of the journey. It's part of the process. Be okay with raising your hand, just like NeQuetta has taught us, and say, hey, my child is having some behaviors. Are you seeing those same behaviors at school? And, what's this thing? Even if you don't know all of the language, call it FBA. You may not even understand what it means.
I agree. What the school will try and do typically is get the parent to go into getting a 504 plan because it's so much easier. It's one piece of paper. It's basically a one-page treatment plan. I encourage the parent to ask for an FBA. 504 plans are so loose. I hate to say this, but a lot of people don't follow them. FBAs are very strict, and a lot of people do follow them, and they request them.
So this is extremely important information for you out there, and I think it's so important. Is there something else you would want our audience to understand or know when it comes to FBA that you think would be beneficial? Is it something that they can do at home, or this is strictly something that is done by a professional?
I'm glad you mentioned that. I tell every parent to get a copy of their FBA. A lot of times, every parent I talk to that I've done an FBA for, they receive a copy. But I've talked to parents, they've never seen their FBA. So you're putting a plan in place. Now remember, the FBA has the target behaviors, the interventions, the triggers, the function, as well as resources. So if you never gave that to the parent, how is she going to work with the student? Typically, the therapist is only giving it to the agency, which is the law. You do have to give it to the agency, but there is nothing to say you can't give it to the parent and sit down and review it with
So as a parent, you have a right to have copies of this FBA and be able to implement those same strategies at home so that everybody's working for the best interest of the child that's on the spectrum.
Absolutely. And after that FBA is conducted, it goes to the evaluator. The evaluator has to see this child and family. They have to submit that to the insurance company. Within a month or two, they have services. That is perfect for the BSC, TSS to start with something in front of their face to say, hey, this is what's going on with the child, versus listening to a parent who has very limited information.
And just before we end the show, I just want to say this last thing. The FBA is not just for kids. It's also for adults.
Yes, it is. It's for everyone.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. And I just want our viewers to know out there, we are going to actually put in our resource guide all of these alphabets, these letters we've been throwing around, because for some of you who have been dealing and on this journey for some time with autism, I know that all of this language can sometimes be confusing. And if you're a new parent that has a child that's been diagnosed with autism, this language is new to you. So we hope that you found this information very useful today on our segment of Let's Talk. For more information or stories like these, please log on to www.onthespectrum.tv. And don't miss our show by simply subscribing to our YouTube channel. That's all the time we have. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time on The Spectrum.